in those 8 or 9 years, I think that's the first time I've heard you say, "I'll be quiet." um, so first for everything today. I'm Ted, clearly. Um, so the story I want to tell you today makes more sense, I think, if I start at the end of the story. So we'll start at the end, and I'm in the newspaper business. I don't get to do that very often, so it's kind of fun for me to start and work backwards. The end of the story is on Christmas Day of 2013. On Christmas Day of 2013, as my wife and I often do, we had invited a lot of friends to come to our house for dinner. It's kind of become a thing for us on Christmas. So Christmas night, we're all seated in the dining room. Everybody's sitting around the table, and we had friends from here. We had some friends from Tulsa. And one of our friends from Tulsa knew that I was behind an event that was happening in a couple of weeks, but he didn't really know the backstory. He didn't know anything about it. So he started asking questions, and I explained to him what we were doing. We were doing this 5K run, and if you ran in the 5K, you got a ticket to the Barons hockey game that night, and all of it was sort of meant to be kind of a memorial for my son who had died in July that year. So as we told the story, he didn't know any of the backstory. He didn't know anything about Colby, so I had to tell him the whole backstory, I'm sure much to the chagrin of everyone else at the table who already knew it. But Colby was mentally ill. He had schizophrenia and paranoia, and he had died in July. And this little event started out because I wanted to do some kind of a memorial. He had died in California, and I was here, so I wanted to do something. And when I thought back on Colby's life, I thought that the time he was happiest, the time he had the close friends in his life, and the time he and I were closest was when he was playing hockey. Right? He played hockey for a few years, and so I wanted to tie it in to hockey in some way. So that's how this hockey thing came about, and I'll come back to that in a moment. As I told the story, though, I finished the story as succinctly as I could, and within a couple of minutes, conversation went around the dining table, as it tends to do. And very quickly, everybody was sharing their favorite anecdote about the time they ran into the crazy person, right? And everybody was sort of giggling and laughing and talking about the guy who used to stand on Robinson out in front of Quiznos and grab the good karma out of the air and rub it on himself, and that story was pretty funny, and somebody else told a similar story. And these are friends of ours. I wasn't offended, right? It wasn't a malicious thing. But I'm sitting there thinking, if I had just explained that I was doing this event because my son had died of cancer, no one would be telling funny stories about the little bald kid, right? No one would be laughing, nobody, right? And it occurred to me at that particular moment that I thought we really needed to change the way we talked about mental illness, right? It's a disease of the brain. It's no different than a disease of the heart or a disease of the lungs or any other physical affliction. Yet we talk about it a whole different way, right? No one ever says, I'm cancerous, right? They say, I have cancer. It's something that happens to you. It's an affliction. Yet people don't hesitate to say, I'm schizophrenic, right? Mental illness is the only place where people tend to become the disease that afflicts them, right? We only talk about mental illness that way. We don't talk about any other kind of ailment that way. And so I thought it was important, maybe because I do words for a living, that we start to change the words we use and we change the way we talk about it, and maybe that in turn would lead to eliminating some of the stigma and getting some better funding and some of the other things that I felt strongly needed to happen. So to put that in context a little bit, let me tell you a little about Colby, right? Colby and I moved from Northern California to Southeast Texas when he was 7 years old, and we went ahead of his mother and his sister. So he and I are in the car. It's a really much longer drive than one might expect from San Francisco to Houston in July in an '85 Peugeot, um, and 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 we're going though, right? We're going, and the 7-year-old is sleeping through some of it, awake for some of it. We didn't have DVD players in the cars. We didn't have, right? He just sort of, and he was a pretty good little trooper all the way along. He was an unusually self-aware child, and he made a lot of really fun observations. When he was about 4, I think, personal computers were still a fairly new thing, right? And our newspaper, where I was working at the time, had just bought its first laser printer. I mean, this is, And he came into the office one day, and we just recently phased out typewriters. And there's this old manual, Royal typewriter sitting on the floor in the morgue where we keep the back copies. And he wandered in and looked at it and went, "Hey, Dad, look at this." I was like, "What?" He pointed at it. He goes, "It's a really old computer." And he'd never seen anything that had a keyboard that wasn't a computer. It made perfect sense to him. So we go on this trek from Northern California to Southeast Texas, and the car started acting up. And let me tell you, you haven't lived unless you've been stranded in West Texas on a Friday night in an '85 Peugeot, because they don't have a lot of parts for those in Del Rio County. But we eventually made it. We went through our first southern thunderstorm. We finally got to Texas, and we spent the first month living in an unfurnished apartment because somebody was nice enough to let us rent it for a month. And we slept in sleeping bags on the living room floor, and we had 2 plastic bowls and 2 plastic spoons, and we ate a lot of fast food and a few boxes of cereal. We had a little portable 12-inch, TV. I remember trying to watch the Summer Olympics and get the antenna to work. So he went through the whole thing with a smile on his face. He just thought it was a great adventure. Colby managed to keep that kind of sense of self-awareness and humor about himself all the way through, right? And he would occasionally do some kind of silly things. We were at Whataburger one time, and he stood at the counter, and he ordered a bacon cheeseburger and told them to hold the bacon. And we thought that was kind of funny, and he had to stop for a minute and think about what he just said, and then he laughed along with everybody else, right? And we were, Colby started playing hockey, got interested in hockey and started playing, and the years he played hockey, he never once got hurt playing hockey. Most kids don't. It's not really as bad as you think. The 2 times he got hurt, once was at a public skate. That's dangerous. He's at a public skate, and he was showing off. Might have been a 14-year-old girl involved, but he was showing off for someone, and didn't quite judge his stopping distance quite right, and just went straight into the wall and the glass. The other time he got hurt was after a hockey game. He was messing around in the locker room, and the boys are being boys, and they're goofing around, and as they got a little too rowdy, they were tossing a hockey skate around, and those are sharper than you might think, and it cut him across the arm badly enough that he had to go get about 8 or 9 stitches in the arm, right? That's his hockey injury, is from the locker room. And, I looked at him, and I was like, really? Right? The locker room is where you're going to have to get stitched up? And in that self-aware, self-depreciating way that he had, he just kind of looked at me and went, "You know me, Dad. I have to learn everything the hard way." Right? And he did, but he knew that he did. Well, by the time he got into late adolescence, which is when most serious mental illness starts to take hold, things started to get a little strange around Colby, right? He didn't behave the other way other kids were behaving. He didn't say the things you'd expect him to say. He became what we eventually figured out was more and more delusional as we went along, right? And so Colby would come home and tell you stories that didn't make a lot of sense. right? And you eventually figured out that the stories he was telling you were as real to him as us sitting in this room, right? They weren't fantasies to him. They weren't something that might happen. They were things that were really happening at that moment, right? So when he'd come in and tell me about driving down the freeway with 6 other cars pursuing him, each being driven by someone who meant him harm, who was going to hurt him or kill him, and he had to outrun them or fight them, that was really happening to him, right? And those sorts of delusions, he worked on the ring crew for some horse shows for his grandmother. His grandmother produced shows for hunters and jumpers, and she'd hire him to come help move things around and be part of the ring crew. And he would sleep in kind of a dorm with the other guys on the ring crew, but he'd force himself to stay awake all night because he was certain that they meant to do some pretty awful things to him if he fell asleep. Right? So then you would see that manifest in some scary ways, like the night he, drove his car into a brick wall at 50 miles an hour for no apparent reason, was in a coma for a couple of days. There was the day that he hit his grandmother over the head with a wine bottle for no reason that he could explain at the moment. He was remorseful later, but really couldn't explain why he did it. We're pretty sure he was defending himself against a threat of some kind that none of the rest of us could see. Right? If you are terrified all the time, you tend to look for a way to alleviate that terror. And so Colby used marijuana, he used alcohol, he used whatever he could find to try to minimize some of that fear that he felt all the time. So he ended up in jail a couple of times. And with serious mental illness like that, you often see that someone may be defending themselves against a threat no one else sees, and the way they end up defending themselves also happens to be a felony, right? So we end up with a lot of people in our prison system who are there because they saw something the rest of us didn't see, or they behaved in a way the rest of us didn't expect. One thing that I worried about was I saw a YouTube video. There's a woman on a subway who's clearly having a mental breakdown of some kind, right? She's parting from reality. You can see her start rocking back and forth. She starts talking to herself. You don't have to be a psychiatrist to see that this is a psychotic break manifesting. And finally, she just attacks the guy sitting across from her for no reason anybody else can see, but she does. And he starts out defending himself in the video, and then he goes on the offensive, and he attacks her, right? And he just beats the hell out of her, much to the applause and delight of everybody else on the subway. Right? And I thought at that moment, like the same thought I had at the dinner table, that what other disease would we respond that way when we saw somebody in crisis? Right? If you saw somebody having a heart attack, if you saw someone having a seizure, if you saw someone have a fainting spell, your initial reaction would be to get on the phone and get them some help, right? You would call them an ambulance, you'd get them some help. But when we see somebody afflicted with a mental disorder manifest symptoms in that way, we don't call and get them help. We call the police and we get them incarcerated, right? So just for some fun statistics, Oklahoma right now is 47th in per capita funding for mental illness, right? And it has been for a very long time, okay? We are also second or third in incarceration rate per capita. And I will tell you, this is an issue where the district attorney and the public defender are 100% in agreement of what some of our prison overcrowding problems are really about. Colby, I will tell you, was happy in jail. His longest stretch was about 6 months. And he would call me from time to time while he was in jail. And you could just tell talking to him that he was comfortable there because he didn't have to navigate anything. Somebody told him what time to get up. what to eat, what to wear, when to exercise, when to go to bed. He didn't have to figure out any of those things for himself. Now, if you think you have a hard time navigating your health insurance, right, much less any public bureaucracy, I mean, I have trouble with my library card, right, because it's, right? Imagine being Colby and having to navigate that system to get help on your own, right? It's not doable. It's too overwhelming. So he was happier in jail. He was happier sleeping on a park bench because he couldn't navigate the system to get the public assistance that would pay for housing for him. It was too big for him to do. Okay? And he's an adult. So let me tell you, he occasionally would react violently when he was defending himself. It's a really terrible thing to be afraid of your child, right? And he was bigger than I am. I mean, it was scary. So in the end, Colby one night had been drinking. He had done some cocaine. We don't know what else he'd done. But in the wee hours of the morning, he parked his car on the side of the road, left it running, left the stereo on, stripped down to his boxers, and decided he needed to go swimming in the creek at 3 a.m. and dove in and hit his head on a rock and drowned. So that's not the kind of behavior sane people exhibit, right? That's a death caused by mental illness. I knew when I first got him diagnosed, I picked a psychiatrist out of the Yellow Pages who was fortunately very down to earth and not terrified of HIPAA and was willing to tell me what was going on. And when I asked him how these things played out, his words were, there are no happy endings. He goes, they either end up dead or in prison. There are no happy endings. So we knew for a long time that phone call would eventually come, right? Someday the phone was going to ring and it was going to be really bad news. So one day the phone rang in July of 2013 and my wife answered it and it was really bad news. Her sister, who suffered from bipolar disorder and was an alcoholic, was dead. And they found the empty pill bottle and the empty vodka bottle, and we are not sure if it was accidental or intentional. It depends which way you want to look at it. There had been a couple of prior suicide attempts, right? Clearly, her death was related to mental illness. So we went to Missouri. We had the funeral. We came back home later that week, and on Saturday, our son, this is second wife, my son, who was then 6, right, had been riding his scooter through the kitchen and lost it on a curve, fell into the cabinets and broke his arm. He hasn't ridden the scooter in the house since. I've never had to tell him again, right? Fell into the counters, broke his arm, is on the way. My wife's driving him to the emergency room to get the broken arm fixed. And that was the day we got the call about Colby. So we had the two of them within 6 days of one another. So we were getting sympathy cards in plural, right? Sorry for your losses, and both sadly similar circumstances. What that led to was I wanted to do something. We're back to the beginning of the story, which is the end of the story, which is that I wanted to do something to memorialize Colby. I just felt like I needed to do something. So I thought, well, we'll have a hockey game. We'll get all the old guys back together and we'll have a game. And I quickly found out that all the old guys had also become 28 years old by then, and they were scattered out. They were in Canada, they were in Tennessee. That wasn't going to work. So I thought, well, the Barons. I know one guy at the Barons. I knew John Allgood. So I called the Barons and went, could we do it? And I'm thinking, you know, a moment of silence and put his picture up on the scoreboard or something, right? And we'll have some of his friends come. And John said, well, let me ask Bob Funk if, you know, see what he wants to do with that, and let's schedule coffee. And John called me back about 20 minutes later and said, forget coffee. I ran into Bob in the hall. We're in. Whatever you want to do, we're in. So we did eventually have the coffee, and somebody said, you know, we should have a 5K with this, and we should, and it turned into a thing, right? And all of a sudden, there were 800 people involved the first year. and there was like $40,000 in the bank, which I realized had my Social Security number attached to it, and and I thought that's not really going to work out for me. So so that necessity caused me to form, the world's smallest nonprofit, now known as the Colby Foundation, and decided, because of what happened, I had gone to the Oklahoman, who was a competitor. They agreed to help with the event. Everybody I talked to agreed to help with the event, and everybody had a story to tell about their family member who had been in similar circumstances. So to me, the mission should be, there should be some public awareness, that we should start this conversation, that we should all start talking to each other about it, because if we did, perhaps we might be able to change the way we deal with mental illness. So now we've had several events. We've done some art shows. We did another 5K with the Barons. We've done some other things with Leadership Oklahoma and some other organizations. This last week I spoke at a legislative reception on this topic with Kelly Fry, the editor of the Oklahoman, who has a son exactly the same age as Colby, who suffers from bipolar disorder and depression and substance abuse issues. So it is such a pervasive issue, we thought it made sense to overcome our competitiveness and tackle this together. I would encourage or challenge each of you, whatever it is in your life that is important to you, I promise you it is important to thousands and thousands of other people. And all you have to do is decide that somebody should do something about it, and it may as well be you, and you will be amazed at the outpouring of assistance you'll get as soon as you decide to do that, and something good will come of it. Thanks for having me.